over the rooftops of the city and donned t-shirts with the slogan, "My future is not a dream." For Chow Fei, the message of her film was clear. Even when life is difficult or boring for people, their dreams can give them some power. But when Whose Utopia was released, audiences saw it as a commentary on the cruelty of capitalism, the fantasy elements inserted to highlight the workers' wretchedness. She was hoping that they would see something more complex. When she talked to the workers, she discovered that, rather than feeling exploited, they felt lucky to have escaped poverty in the countryside for a job where they could help their families and themselves. Chow Fei was wry when she told me this, pointing out that it was important not just to see the issues from a correct line perspective. Despite my natural cynicism as a journalist, I knew immediately what she meant. I had been there myself. In 1996, I had teamed up with ABC TV's new China correspondent, Jane Hutchin, to tell the story of China's floating population. We had decided to look at it through the eyes of a young ragpicker from Anhui, who we had found living on the fringes of Beijing. He had sunk all his resources into a pedal cart, on which he scoured the city collecting cardboard, plastic bottles, cans, and every other kind of rubbish that could be turned into cash, selling it on for tiny sums to professional recyclers, one rung up the economic ladder from him. Yet he was managing to house and feed his wife and child on the money he was making, as well as sending some funds home to his parents and saving a little too. When we traveled back with him at Chinese New Year to his home in a hard-scrabbled village in the heartland of Anhui, we saw him greeted like a hero and glowing with happiness at his parents' evident pride. We saw the benefits his remittance had brought in the quality of the food his parents ate and in the improvements to their house. Nearby we saw the local version of a mansion being built. It was owned by a man known as Mr. Shanghai for the city in which he had made his fortune. In this village, everyone but the old or the very young had either left for the cities or were planning to do so. It was hard to deny the power of the urban dream. Further up the economic ladder from China's floating population were the young people with an education looking for routes to success in the new economy. For many, the solution was Shahai, meaning literally jump into the ocean. Shahai is Chinese slang for going into business, but it also implies taking a chance, jumping out of the box you'd been put in, swimming free. Deprived of the place in the nation many of the Tiananmen generation might have dreamed of, blocked from work in the bureaucracy or in academia, or simply finding these paths too frustrating, they embraced business instead. It was one of the ironies of the 1990s that while much of the youthful idealism of the 1980s had disappeared, the reforming economy created opportunities that sparked a boom in youth culture across urban China in the new decade. Rock music exploded, and fashion followed, as did bars, cafes, and restaurants that opened late, bringing life to the cities that had once been shuttered and dark at 6 p.m. Gay culture became more visible, as did the guys and girls we called liumeng. Liumeng was Chinese for hoodlum, but these liumeng were much more than that. They were punk and grunge, rock and pop. They were whatever the official culture did not want youth to be. Like outlaws in a Hollywood Western, they were avatars for their generation's alienation. They were cool. It didn't hurt that a whole range of things that people like to do, like extramarital sex, were branded as hooliganism under Chinese law, and hooliganism was, till 1997, a crime. In Beijing filming our Deng Xiaoping obituary in 1995, we were surrounded by the Shahai spirit. It was there in the characters we interviewed, and it was there among many of my friends, too. One couple I knew paid the bills with the husband's salary from his assigned job teaching oil painting at an art college, while the wife ran a thriving business selling trinkets and beautifully forged ration tickets on the side. With the cash she earned, they rented part of a courtyard house deep in the center of the city where they could make art, preside over an open-door salon, and escape the college's prying eyes. Then there was the painter I'd last seen hanging out at the old Summer Palace's art village, living from hand to mouth. At the time, he had agonized to me about the creeping commercialization of the art scene and the need to stay true to his ideals as a painter. When I next saw him in 1995, he had opened a chic restaurant in the middle of Beijing's Sanlitun Embassy Quarter and was planning to expand into a chain. He was the first of my friends to tell me his ambition was to make enough money to one day be a person of influence. Only then would his generation really have a chance to change China. This was quite a common sentiment in those days among the young entrepreneurs who were doing well. Get rich and change China was almost a slogan. And so, in the 1990s, the children of the revolutionaries would become crony capitalists, and one-time workers would become middle class. The South would boom and the North would rust, and one-time idealists would go into business. Many creative artists, though, still preferred to live on the edge in one way or another. For some, keeping their heads down just wasn't in their nature. In the year after June 4th, Cui Jian performed his song, A Piece of Red Cloth, in a series of high-profile concerts, each time putting on a red blindfold before he began to sing. As a result, he was banned from playing in Beijing for the whole of the 90s, and his music was blacklisted on TV and radio. Many others just wanted to fly under the radar and make art. At the end of 1994, after months of rising tension, the police broke up what was left of the artist village at the Old Summer Palace. For several months before the crackdown, artists had been leaving the village in search of new places where they could live and work, some even heading abroad. Many moved out to a village called Songzhuang in the neighboring province of Hebei. Meanwhile, inside Beijing, a new colony of artists had established themselves in a workers' village on the city's eastern fringe. They christened the place East Village in homage to the eponymous Bohemian district in New York. These artists were a special breed, and the East Village precinct, now long gone, nurtured some of China's finest art talents. Those who were set up there were interested in pushing themselves to extremes. Their performances range from the gender-bending and sexually provocative work of Ma Liuming to the masochistic feats of endurance of Zhang Huan. These events, held for small groups of friends and critics and photographed by their fellow artist Rongrong, eventually attracted the attention of police. Ma and Zhang were both arrested, with Ma spending 3 months in detention for distributing pornography. Zhang Huan later wrote that his work at the time was aimed at experiencing the authentic existence of adaptability and endurance. The most infamous of his performances was entitled 12 Square Meters, named for the dimensions of the noisome village toilet in which he sat for an hour, naked and covered in honey and fish oil, giving himself over to the attentions of swarms of flies. Rongrong's photographs of the performance, showing Zhang's shaven head in the half-light, have the stoic beauty of a Renaissance painting of a martyr. The day Zhang was arrested, he was attempting an even more painful feat, hanging naked in chains from the rafters of his studio, blood dripping from a tube inserted in his arm onto a heated hot plate below. The smell of burning blood and the sizzling of his sweat as it was dripped onto the hot plate made the piece almost unbearable to watch, let alone perform, and yet he persisted for an hour. In 1997, just before Zhang Huan left China for New York and eventual international art stardom, he joined with a group of 46 itinerant workers to create a piece called To Raise the Water Level in a Fish Pond. The workers waded into a large fish pond, where Zhang finally joined them, carrying the young son of the owner of the pond on his shoulders. This achievement behind this oddly poetic work, that together they had managed to alter the level of the water, was negated by the fact that, as Zhang put it, theirs was in the end an action of no avail. When the police broke up the artists' village at the Old Summer Palace, Cui Jian decided to leave China altogether. He had been there at the start of the village, and he was there for the end. It was time to go. I just wanted to be able to express myself in my art, and I knew that wasn't going to be possible in China, Cui Jian told me. In the months previously, the police had visited him. They seemed to know everything about him, including the fact that he already had a visa for Australia. They said to me, "If I were you, I'd go to Australia and never come back." Then, a week before the village was broken up, a soldier in uniform turned up to see him. Cui Jian didn't know him, but the soldier spoke with the accent of his hometown. He told him he had a message for him, to get out of the Old Summer Palace. He told me, "This place is not going to be allowed to survive. Go anywhere, but don't stay here." It seemed that the army was reaching out to him. They knew he had once been one of them, and they wanted him to know that they were still keeping track of him. Before he left for Australia, he traveled south to see his parents. One day he sat down with his mother to tell her he was leaving. She took the news hard. She kept asking me, "Why? Why do you want to go away?" Suddenly there was a noise in the street that he knew well. The rumble of a convoy of trucks and the bark of a loudspeaker signaled a grim parade. Doomed prisoners were being driven through the city on their way to the execution ground. He had heard that sound with sickening regularity during the Cultural Revolution, when mass shootings would be held on every major holiday or festival. even on Children's Day, he had once grimly recalled. As the trucks rolled by, the loudspeakers blaring out the crimes of the condemned, he turned to his mother. "Do you hear that, Mom? If I don't go, one day I could be on that truck." In the early years of the 1990s, many aspiring artists leapt at the opportunity to leave China, creating parallel tracks for the development of the contemporary art movement. Many Chinese artists rose to prominence in their new hometowns, New York, Sydney, Paris, and London, where they joined the Western art system of commercial galleries, museums, biennales, and art fairs. Meanwhile, a different kind of art scene evolved in China. There was almost no infrastructure to support contemporary art, so artists retained their independence and learned to manage their own careers. They represented themselves in their limited dealings with the market and with the Western curators, who eventually came calling. The artists banded together in the artists' villages, staging informal exhibition and happenings, pushing each other and themselves. They teamed up with rock musicians and filmmakers, dancers and actors, writers and bar owners to create an alternative world far removed from what passed for the official culture and sanctioned forms of entertainment. "It's funny," Anwar said to me one day not long ago. "During the 90s, we were so down on everything, feeling it was such a come down from how things were in the 80s. And yet looking back, you can see it was actually a really great time for art, for life. Every week a new bar would open. There was a lot of drinking, a lot of music." In the same way that the 80s in China echoed the 60s in the West, the 90s were a bit like the 70s. It was a decade that people continually declared inferior to what had gone before, while ignoring how much deeper contemporary culture was becoming, how fiercely artists were mining the emotional terrain, and how determinedly people were working to allow contemporary culture to sustain itself and to grow. In those years, Anwar's one-room apartment became an oasis in Beijing. He would leave his door unlocked, and most nights 10 or 20 friends would congregate for a party, dousing down at the end of the evening on the bed that sat at the center of the room, or curling up on the Xinjiang carpets that softened the chill of the floor while Anwar painted deep into the night. In those years, he was creating his own language of color and light that distilled icons from his homeland of Xinjiang into richly colored curves and strokes that kaleidoscoped across the canvas. He had come to the capital of China from a place so far away that its capital sits at the pole of inaccessibility of the Eurasian landmass, the point that is farther from the sea than any other in Europe or Asia. In Xinjiang, ancient oasis towns confront the immensity of the Taklamakan Desert and the soaring peaks of the Karakoram. Anwar had grown up saturated with color and light. His earliest memories were of sunlight strobing through the leaves of the poplars that colonnaded the back roads of Xinjiang. He remembers being lifted up to face the intensity of a limitless blue sky, watching the play of color flashing on his eyelids when he closed his eyes. Arriving in the monochrome Beijing of the 1980s had been a shock to his senses, and it had even leaked into his dreams, turning them black and white for the first time in his life. Anwar's paintings, at first figurative and as the decade progressed increasingly abstract, sought to capture the exhilarating meeting of the human and the cosmic that the vistas of Xinjiang can offer. As the decade came to a close, his canvases became richer and more assured. With decorative borders that suggested the woven oriental rugs of Xinjiang, the paintings took on the quality of magic carpets to another world. In 2000, he showed them in the Courtyard Gallery in Beijing, then the leading contemporary space in the city. He chose an entry in his diary from 1989 to describe what he believed was the purpose of art. "It is not only to stimulate and to excite people. On a deeper level, it is also to help them forget their agitation." Perhaps more than any other artist from the 1980s, he retained something of the pure spirit of that decade's bohemia, a dedication to art for art's sake, beyond politics. In going deeper, his work didn't get darker. Unlike that of many of his peers, it got freer. As he once said, "If you allow yourself the quiet of mind to follow your instincts, art rewards you with a huge space, and within it, you can do as you wish." Recently, Bao Tong, who was Zhao Ziyang's secretary and longtime advisor during the 1980s, gave his verdict on the legacy of Deng Xiaoping. Under a form of house arrest even today, after being imprisoned for 7 years after the Tiananmen crackdown, Bao Tong has become one of contemporary China's most mordant critics. His verdict? "The upshot of Deng's revolution was that those with significant power got significantly rich. Those with modest power got modestly rich, and those with no power remained in poverty. This verdict is too sweeping and too tough. True, the gap between the rich and poor, between the Rust Belt North and the booming South, and, most worryingly, between the city and the country, has become enormous by the end of the 90s. And although the booming economy had given millions of people the chance to aim for a better life, workers remained vulnerable in a system that was stacked against them and where corruption was rife. While huge numbers of people became property owners for the first time, they would also find that their rights mattered little if their property stood in the way of development. But for all that, there is no question that by the end of the 1990s, China had been transformed. The state had largely completed its retreat from private life. Permission to marry was no longer in the gift of your work unit, and extramarital sex was no longer illegal. Neither was homosexuality. For those with any money at all to spend, life in the city was infinitely more comfortable, more colorful, and more fun. Creative life may have been less idealistic than in the 80s, but the work of artists, writers, and musicians was connecting their society at a level that was both intense and profound. They were also finding a way to build their careers beyond the control of the state. In 1999, artists such as Zhang Huan and Ma Liuming, who had been arrested for their work in the middle of the decade, found themselves feted at the Venice Biennale, thanks to their ability to attract attention of Western collectors and curators. In each year of the 1990s, 25 million people were lifted out of poverty. That may not have been lifted far by Western standards, but it was hard to discount the experience of people like Mr. Xiao, the rag picker from Anhui, whose home we had visited. Before we left him, he had confided his ambition. He was saving up to become a chauffeur, and when he did, he planned to save as hard as he could so when his son grew up, he would be able to see him through university. The point was not that he had had that dream. It was that we couldn't deny that it was within his grasp. In 1999, Zhang Shaogang moved to Beijing to live, leaving behind his adopted home of Chengdu and his birthplace of Kunming. When he arrived, he told me he realized what was most essential for him to understand if he was to succeed. "If you want a new life, you need to forget the past," he told me. "It may seem like a contradiction to suffer the pain of putting aside your old life in order to experience the pleasure of the new, but you must." During the 1990s, the whole Chinese nation seemed to take this advice. In order to go forward, they put aside the past and embraced forgetting. The 1980s was dead. A new century was in front of them. They had to go forward and not look back. Chapter 8. Beijing Welcomes You. I called the number on the lamppost and waited on the corner as instructed. It was late autumn but still warm, the scholar trees lining the quiet street heavy with golden leaves. Across the road, a man was mending shoes under a red and yellow umbrella. Street traders were still everywhere in Beijing. That was one thing that hadn't changed. One of the many things that had changed was that everyone now had a mobile phone. Mine, which I had just used to set up my street corner assignment, was a pale blue Motorola bought second-hand in the market. I was told later that probably meant it was stolen. Just a few weeks after that, a pickpocket lifted it, completing the karmic circle. A motor scooter drove up onto the sidewalk and parked beside me. Two 20-somethings in padded jackets and tight trousers dismounted and handed me a card. These were the mobile real estate agents I was waiting for. They listened gravely to my wish list and assured me they could find me just what I was after. When I arrived in Beijing in the spring of 2004, I had no intention of moving back to China. I had spent the previous 4 years freelancing out of Europe, but had returned home to Australia at the end of 2003 after a family tragedy. My little brother had died in a senseless accident, after which my life abroad seemed pointless. But once I returned home, I found I couldn't settle down there either. A friend in Beijing suggested a holiday in China as a circuit breaker. Miserable and skeptical, I got on the plane. As soon as I touched down in Beijing, I knew I wanted to stay. There was a sense of excitement and possibility that I hadn't felt since the 1980s. So many of the people I knew who had left after 1989 were back in the country, drawn by a burgeoning economy and by the sense that other less tangible things might once again be possible. On the first day, my friend told me there was an art opening that we must go to, and that on the way, he wanted to show me something else, an art district called 798. Both parts of the program sounded strange to me. The last time I'd lived in China, the only art openings I knew had either been visited by the police or held in a private venue, such as a diplomat's apartment. And the idea of an art district sounded unlikely. I knew the artist's village, of course, but the word district suggested something more solid. Discovering the 798 district that day was a revelation. It existed in a region behind the airport expressway, which had once been literally off the map. In the 1980s, official Chinese maps had shown the district as an empty space, but the CIA map of Beijing that American friends liked to hang on their walls identified it as a complex of military factories covering half a square kilometer. For more than 30 years, the area was home to up to 20,000 workers who labored over military components in soaring Bauhaus spaces. The factories had been designed in the 1950s by East German architects who were then enthralled to their native modernist style. The arching sawtooth roofs were set with windows angled perfectly to catch the natural light, even in the darkest days of winter, while simple rib buttresses supported the curving walls, leaving the spaces airy and open. Deng's reform started closing these factories in the late 1980s. By the time I arrived, the workers had long gone, but revolutionary slogans in huge red characters, 10,000 years to Chairman Mao, still shrieked out over silent machinery. On that rainy spring day in 2004, the district was still being colonized. Sculptures from the Central Academy of Fine Arts had taken over some spaces at its fringes, and a bookstore, Time Zone 8, had set up in what had once been a workers' canteen. At the center of the district was the 798 factory itself, which was being developed as an art gallery, and tucked in beside it was a cafe. As it turned out, both the art gallery and the cafe were projects of an artist whose name I heard, but was yet to meet. Huang Rui, who had co-founded the Stars a quarter of a century earlier. Huang Rui had moved into the district 2 years before, and with a group of other artists had developed a manifesto for what they wanted to create there. The document rang with all the idealism of the original Stars. Here the ideal of the avant-garde will coexist with the flavor of the past. The notion of experimentation will be emphasized together with social responsibility, and spiritual and financial pursuits will prevail simultaneously. When he moved into 798 in 2002, Huang Rui had only recently been allowed to return to China. He had attempted a homecoming in the early 1990s, but had soon attracted the attention of the police. The artistic performances he designed around essential elements like fire and water were considered provocations by the authorities. They are very subtly suspect. To the authorities, Huang Rui and his work were a dangerous throwback to pre-1989 China. In 1995, he had been deported back to Japan and barred from returning until the new century. Now he was determined to create what he later described to me as a safe zone for artists in the capital. He believed the key was to make 798 renowned for both its creativity and its commercial success. This would become his great project in the early years of the century, for which he spearheaded a battle to save the district from the wrecking ball in a city where the developers were now king. Today, 798 is a celebrated part of Beijing's cultural landscape and a template for similar districts across the country. Since 1979, contemporary art had survived in the half-light of grudging official tolerance. What won its security was commercial success. In the first decade of the 21st century, the Western art market embraced Chinese contemporary art, and by 2006 was delivering multi-million-dollar prices for works that had been created in the dark period post-1989. China's cultural authorities sat up and took notice. But that was still a couple of years in the future when I wandered with my friend through the half-deserted factory buildings of 798 in 2004. In fact, there wasn't a lot of art to see. Outside the cafe stood a kind of rocket ship made of bathroom fittings, and inside were some silk-screen prints which punned on the fact that the English word China sounds like the Chinese phrase for demolish that. On the corner of one alley, though, we discovered a sculpture that remains for me the icon of the 798 district. It is a bronze of a model worker, legs akimbo, arms thrust forward in a traditional propaganda pose. But the extended fist, instead of wielding a hammer, brandishes an artist's paintbrush. The sculpture, which still stands in 798 today, seems to me a perfect up yours to the dead ideals of Maoist art. I took it as a sign that the China I loved was alive and well. Having seen it, I couldn't resist being part of it. As a base for my second sojourn in China, I applied to work with China Radio International, CRI, part of the country's extensive state-controlled media. As a foreign journalist, I had spent a lot of time tunneling under China's protective propaganda wall, and I was intrigued by the idea of seeing how things worked on the other side. Apart from that, I was interested in the chance to work with young Chinese journalists, which I was told was a major part of the job. I assumed that as soon as they ran the usual police check on my application, the job would be off the table. Over the years of reporting and producing stories from China, I had had my fair share of brushes with the police and had built up a healthy file with them. But the job came through, and by October 2004, I was armed with a work visa and on my way back to China. 2 months later, my husband joined me. When I'd lived in China in the 1980s, there had been no question of foreigners renting privately. We were all corralled in compounds of one sort or another, like the diplomatic quarters or the Friendship Hotel. Private apartments didn't really exist, as most urban housing was controlled by the work units to which all city dwellers were supposed to be assigned. But that had all changed in the 1990s with the state-owned enterprise, SOE reforms, and the privatization of urban housing. It wasn't long before enterprising property owners started to tap the expat market. When I arrived at CRI, the management was just beginning to experiment with the idea of their foreign experts renting privately. The Friendship Hotel, where they'd been used to housing them, had begun charging market rates, and it was clear CRI could save money by giving us an accommodation allowance instead that would cover the rent on a modest apartment. I decided to look for a place in Beijing's western suburbs, not too far from the center of town, but on a subway line that would take me to the CRI headquarters. As this was not a fashionable part of the city for foreigners, the local English-language listing magazines were no help in finding a place, which is why I found myself peering at lampposts in my target neighborhood, copying down the numbers of people who were offering likely accommodation. My mobile real estate agents had no office. What they had were contacts, mobile phones, a motor scooter, and chutzpah. They charged a month's rent as a fee, to be split between the landlord and the tenant. They showed me a handful of places, all, as I would learn later, owned by employees or former employees of the Department of Railways. I finally settled on a tiny one-bedroom place in a 9-story block on a leafy street. My landlord still worked for the railways. He had bought his assigned apartment when he got the chance and had a separate home elsewhere, courtesy of his wife. Along with most of his neighborhood, he had transformed himself from ordinary worker into landlord, thanks to the SOE reforms. The place was bare-bone accommodations by Western standards. The kitchen was a gas ring beside a tiny sink, but it was sunny and quiet. My landlord explained that I would get excellent phone and internet and television reception, and that proved to be the case. It was only some months later that I realized this was courtesy of the Western District's Army base located nearby. The Army, naturally enough, put a premium on efficient communications. The Railways Department still dominated the area in many small ways. At 7 a.m. they would broadcast a jaunty tune aimed at getting us out of bed and exercising before the day began. They ran various public education programs on issues such as drugs or AIDS and organized blood drives. The Railways theater troupe was also hanging on in the neighborhood, still treading the boards of the dedicated theater for which my street was named. It was called the February 7th Theater, commemorating the date of an historic rail strike in 1923, which had been violently put down. Rivaling the patriotically named theater as a local landmark was a new Eternal Peace shopping center, which sold everything from German white goods to Australian wine and which teemed with shoppers day and night. Once I was settled in and had got to know the neighborhood, I went, as instructed by CRI, to register with the police at the local Public Security Bureau, PSB. It didn't go well. The policewoman on the registration counter looked at my passport with alarm. I had been in the country for almost 3 weeks. There was no question of processing my registration. I was asked to wait. An hour ticked past, then 2. I watched a steady trickle of miscreants being hustled through the front door and into the basement. I started to wonder whether I would soon be heading down there myself. Through the glass entrance, I watched carefree citizens strolling in the sunlight. Freedom was meters away, but the police had my passport, so I waited. Finally, the front door swung open to admit a 30-something man in a crumpled raincoat who reminded me of the eponymous detective played by Peter Falk in Columbo. This helped me relax. So did the interview room, which was on an upper floor and not in the basement. Mr. Detective Columba was the Foreigners Liaison Officer brought in from PSB headquarters to handle my case. He explained to me the law in relation to foreigners and the various ways in which I had broken it, most notably by failing to report to the PSB within 48 hours of my arrival in Beijing. I tried to pass the buck to CRI, who clearly hadn't grasped how important it was for foreigners to register promptly, but he explained that this was my responsibility. He presented me with a copy in English of the relevant law and asked me to read it aloud. My voice started to falter as I came to the part about the applicable fine of 200 RMB for every day that I was late in registering. Quick mental arithmetic told me that my first month's salary at CRI was going straight back to the government. Again, I pleaded ignorance, but he checkmated me easily. Just like in your country, ignorance of the law is no excuse. But he then went on to explain that there was another way to handle things. If I would consent to write a sincere self-criticism, that fine might be waived. I was familiar with self-criticisms. A favored remedy for wrongdoings in the People's Republic, it requires you to put down on paper all the ways in which you have transgressed and to beg the forgiveness of the authorities. I had written a few of them during my time as a journalist in China. The key to success is not to hold back. I sat down to write under Columba's watchful eye. I acknowledged that ignorance of the law was no excuse and stated that I understood how much I had let down the People's Republic and its laws by my carelessness. I sincerely apologized. He read it over and suggested a few additions, and finally declared himself satisfied. My contrition was noted. The self-criticism would be put on my file, and there would be no fine applied. I was effusive and genuine in my thanks. Accompanying me back to the registration desk, he suddenly stopped. He had neglected something terribly important, he told me, and rubbed his forehead in annoyance at his forgetfulness. This was always the moment in Columba where the trap would snap shut, so my heart started to pound. He reached into his pocket, removed a black plastic wallet, and flipped it open to show me. It was his police badge. My friends told me later that it had been a requirement for years that the police show their ID before questioning anyone, but they very rarely did. There was something about this officer's fidelity to the regulations and the earnest way he had asked me to study the text of the relevant laws that seemed significant. Could it be that even the police were responding to the new mood of the times? The idea of China as a nation governed by the rule of law had been part of the rhetoric of Deng Xiaoping's reforms since the beginning, but it was only in the late 1990s that the rhetoric began to take shape in the real world. In 1996, the Lawyers' Law was passed, which established that lawyers were no longer to be considered servants of the state, but independent professionals. In the late 1990s, a number of cases focusing on individuals' rights were taken up by these newly independent practitioners who drew particularly on the Administrative Procedure Law passed in 1989, which for the first time allowed people to sue state agencies over their decisions, and also on a consumer rights law that was passed in 1993. In 1999 and then again in 2004, the Chinese Constitution was amended, first to enshrine the rule of law and later the protection of human rights. By the time I arrived back in China in 2004, a new breed of what were called rights lawyers had come into being, professionals who focused on key cases where the rights of an individual or group had been infringed. They generally worked pro bono, supporting themselves with other paid work within their practice or as members of a university faculty. The rights lawyers did not shrink from the most difficult or unpopular of clients and cases. Within weeks of my arrival, I heard of lawyers defending members of the outlawed Falun Gong sect and farmers who had been dispossessed of their land. Others were taking on the cause of investigative journalists or workers who are alleging exploitation by their employers. Some of these lawyers used the media, both local and international, to publicize their cases or organize small-scale protests, while others were more low-key. Meanwhile, the role of the Internet in taking cases to the court of public opinion was growing. A quarter-century of reform had created multiple stresses across Chinese society. Breakneck development had revealed an underlying weakness in the gains that had been made by Chinese farmers and the new urban middle class. The reforms of the late 1970s had given farmers control over their land, but it had not given them ownership. As China urbanized, more and more farmers were finding their land threatened by development. Compensation when land was compulsorily required by the state was often pitiful, and all the more so when compared to what the land fetched when the rights were sold on to developers. Meanwhile, urban dwellers were discovering their newly acquired homes could be vulnerable too. If they lived in areas ripe for redevelopment, they could find themselves homeless and hopelessly undercompensated. The corruption that attended such land grabs added to the sense of grievance. Property could also be threatened by rampant industrial development or pollution. Workers were vulnerable to exploitation in the nation's booming factories, and those in the floating population found themselves toiling in urban centers without any of the rights of residency that their city neighbors enjoyed, notably access to subsidized health services or to education for their children. These were the issues the rights lawyers were tackling, and they were teaming up with investigative journalists, a growing number of NGOs, and new associations of workers, residents, and other interest groups. Few talked about it in so many words, but I was excited to see in their efforts the building blocks of a civil society emerging, something that could serve as a counterweight to the monolithic role of the Communist Party in representing the will of the people. Once again, I allowed myself to imagine China as a more vibrant, open, and pluralistic society. Of course, this vision had appeared before and evaporated in disappointment or worse, but two things gave me hope this time. The first was the weight of history. Most of these new players had been active in the student movement of 1989. Now in their mid to late 30s, they were moving into positions where they could influence society. One of the most prominent of rights lawyers was Fu Zhiqiang, who had never made a secret of his activism in 1989. He rose to prominence as a lawyer in late 2004 when he took up the defense of a pair of investigative journalists who had exposed the brutal exploitation of farmers in Anhui and who had been sued by a local party boss for their pains. Pu had effectively turned the tables in that case, and no conviction was ever recorded against the journalists. This was the first of many freedom of speech cases that he would take up pro bono over the following years while supporting himself as a commercial lawyer. In 2006, he wrote about the need to live in a way that honored the sacrifices of 1989. If I just slouched along through life taking the easy route, what do I say to the spirits of those murdered rioters of 17 years ago? He asked. Our Tiananmen generation is now in middle age. We are in positions where we can make a difference. Do we not want to? The other powerful new factor was the internet. Liu Xiaobo, a tireless reform advocate who had served 19 months in prison after 1989 and had been jailed twice more in the 1990s, has written about the excitement of discovering the web on returning home from prison in 1999. At first, he didn't see the point of the new gadget his wife had installed in their apartment, but he soon realized that the computer connected him to the world and to his fellow citizens in a way that hadn't been possible before, and he became convinced that in China the internet would be a decisive liberating force. It suddenly seemed that I'd picked an exciting time to come back to China, and I wasn't the only one to feel that way. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, many in the Chinese diaspora decided to take a chance on China again. Having achieved qualifications and experience in the West, they came back to participate in a country that seemed to be opening up once more. Among them were many of the artists who had left China after 1989. For Shenqi, it was an animalistic instinct to return, to see his family, to smell the familiar smells, to hear his native tongue spoken around him. He had served a 9-year apprenticeship in the West and returned confident in himself as an artist. He had drifted in his first years away, through 3 years in Italy and a stint in Paris, before he moved to London in 1992. Arriving there, he determined to learn everything he could about Western art, spending long days in London's museums, studying the work at close quarters. At first he supported himself pushing a Yumcha trolley in Chinatown, but soon discovered a better way to make a living nearby. For the next 6 years, Shenqi created charcoal portraits for tourists in Leicester Square, hanging out with the alcoholics and the homeless, being warned by the police. After 4 years, he won a place at the prestigious Central St. Martin's Art School. By the time he got his master's degree in 1998, he was developing a reputation as a performance artist. But even though his work was often provocative or extreme, he wasn't yet dealing with his most provocative act of all. In the years abroad, Shenqi got used to hiding his mutilated left hand in his pocket, nervous that people would see what he had done. But on his return to China, he was determined not to hide it anymore. It was 10 years before I finally realized that my left hand, with its missing finger, had become part of my identity. The severing of my finger, my unique act. I began to photograph it. It was then I realized that personal history could also embody the history of a society. Shunqi's My Left Hand, Me, 2000 will probably always be his most famous work. It is part of the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York and has been featured many times in books about Chinese contemporary art. It is beautiful, sad, and shocking. In the photograph, his hand stands out strongly against a deep red background, the place where his little finger should be, an unsettling void. In the palm of his hand nestles a tiny black and white photo. It shows him as a very young boy, smiling shyly beneath his army cap, innocent of everything that lies ahead of him. By creating this work, he was bidding for recognition of the wounds of a time still unacknowledged in China's official history. Innocence and violence are united in this self-portrait, as they were at Tiananmen Square. And yet, it would be 4 years before the photograph would be critically recognized. When he showed it to the artists and critics he knew in Beijing, they reacted coolly, as if the image meant nothing. Today it's easier for him to understand the discomfort behind their indifference, but that doesn't make it less galling to recall how one critic put aside the image with hardly a glance, shoving it to the side of the table they sat at, letting drops of water fall on it as he poured out their tea. In 2004, Shunqi sent the image to New York to be part of a large exhibition of Chinese contemporary work at the International Center of Photography. There it struck a chord, and it was chosen as a cover image for the show. And so it entered contemporary art history, 4 years after it was pushed out of sight on a crowded table set for tea. In 2004, Gonkar Gyatso visited China for the first time since he had taken the road to Dharamshala 12 years earlier. He had spent 4 years in the Dalai Lama's capital studying Buddhism and the traditional art of Thangka painting. He had fallen in love with the city. Everyone, the monks, the citizens, even the Dalai Lama, lived so close together. It was amazing to see a whole society run by Tibetans. When I arrived, I was interviewed by the Tibetan Security Bureau. Everywhere there were Tibetans. It was very refreshing for me. But after a few years, he realized he had to move on. He was dedicated to being a contemporary artist, and that couldn't happen in Dharamshala. Understandably, the whole society there is quite conservative. They really want to hold on to their traditions and don't want to change. In 1996, he headed to London, where a British artist he had met had helped him secure a place at the Central St. Martin's Art School. He had arrived in London just in time to see the explosive Sensation exhibition, featuring some of the most outrageous headline grabbers from the art collection of advertising guru Charles Saatchi. Among them was the now legendary Shark and Formaldehyde by Damien Hirst, and a tent covered in people's name titled Everyone I Have Ever Slept With, 1963 through 1995, by Tracy Emin. The show galvanized Gonkar. I was blown away. Before, in all the training I had done in both China and in Dharamshala, and in all the books about art that I had read, I had understood that there was a boundary between what is art and what is not art. But after I saw the Sensation show, that concept was completely smashed. I realized everything can be art. There is no limitation. He began to look for ways to make his ultimate inspiration, the figure of the Buddha, more accessible to Western audiences, liberated by the idea that he need no longer use the conventional means of artistic expression that he had relied on up to then. But before he could move on, he knew he must first deal with the question of his own identity as a Tibetan Chinese. The year before he visited Beijing in 2004, he had finally completed in London a photographic work called My Identity. Over 4 panels, he depicted the 4 identities that had defined him during his years as an artist. In the first, he presented himself as a traditional Tibetan painter, creating an intricate Thangka of the Buddha. In the second, he was a good communist, reproducing a standard image of Chairman Mao. In the third, he was a refugee, honoring the image of the Dalai Lama. And lastly, he appeared as a contemporary Western artist, apparently shorn of all ethnicity in a white-walled studio, confronting an abstract canvas. With this work, he believed he had finally laid to rest the search for identity that had obsessed him since he had first left Lhasa to go to university in Beijing. I felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders, he told me. On the way to Lhasa from London in 2004, he stopped in Beijing and walked the streets, astounded by how the city had changed. He went to visit his alma mater, the Minzu University, but he could not find it. The area around the original site had been transformed, the old rambling gardens in which the university had stood long since sold off for development. Even the entrance to the university had moved to a different street. In the end, he gave up the search. He wasn't ready yet to consider returning to China for good. It would be another 12 years before he would be ready to try again to make his home there. In 2005, Guo Jian joined the stream of artists returning to China from the West. He had been in Australia for more than 10 years, making a living as a house painter, brickies laborer and gardener, all the time working on his art, which led to a series of exhibitions that established his name. He had developed a strong, almost pop style, which he used to brilliant effect in a series of works that undercut the propaganda images of military life. His soldiers weren't ideal specimens of socialist rectitude. Their dreams were erotic, not patriotic, and in his paintings, their minds were not filled with famous victories, but with girls, food, and fun. He settled in well in Australia. He liked the casualness and what he saw after living in Beijing as the tranquility of its urban spaces. Where most visitors to the inner city suburb of Newtown would see grittiness, he noticed the planter boxes full of flowers and the friendly people on the street. The live music scene was humming in those years, and so almost every night after his language class, he would go out and see a band. He found it easy to make friends and was amused when the local branch of the Communist Party of Australia tried to bring him into their circle. They were always asking me to sing them a Chinese revolutionary song, and, of course, I wasn't going to do that. So one day I finally said, "Hey, listen up, this is a Chinese revolutionary song," and I sung them Cui Jiang's "Nothing to My Name." By the time he returned to Beijing, his paintings had entered the collections of the National Gallery of Australia and the Queensland's Gallery of Modern Art, and he had become an Australian citizen. But for all his success, he was attracted by the thought of what he could achieve in China. He wanted to try his hand at sculpture, and Beijing offered the studio spaces and the technical know-how that he needed. And he missed his family, his friends, and the food. Within months of arriving in Beijing, he had teamed up with 2 other artist friends from his native Guizhou province to launch a restaurant, 3 Guizhou Men, which quickly became a favorite canteen for the art world in the capital. The restaurant business was a popular second string for artists at the time. Huang Rui had pioneered this with his cafe in 798, and cynical realist Fang Lijin had followed, opening a chain of restaurants specializing in food from Yunnan province. In the new century, contemporary art was safer than it used to be, but it didn't hurt to be in business too. At 3 Guizhou Men, the partners naturally hung their work on the walls, but Guo Jian soon found his own work made his fellow owners uncomfortable. His painting seemed innocent enough. It shows a group of ordinary soldiers grinning broadly as they are serenaded by an army entertainer. One of the soldiers holds a pig ecstatically to his chest, as a chanteuse, resplendent in her dress uniform, looks the viewer straight in the eye, hair shining, teeth sparkling, her glossy red lips and nails glittering in an unseen spotlight. The singer commanding all the attention in Guo Jian's painting bore striking resemblance to Song Zuying, who for more than a decade had been a star of the Spring Festival Gala, the variety show broadcast each Chinese New Year on the national television network. The gala is the pinnacle of officially sanctioned popular culture in China, and there had been long speculation about how Song Zuying came to secure this plum gig year after year. Some said she had been talent spotted by President Jiang Zemin himself when he was in power, and she was also rumored to be his mistress. Whatever the truth, her run on the gala went on for more than 20 years. Hanging in a prominent position by the restaurant entrance, the painting began to attract attention from customers, who swapped knowing remarks about what the soldiers might really be smiling about. One day, a friend of Guo Jian's turned up to dinner with the head of the Chinese Artists Association in tow. "You know that painting could get you closed down," the official remarked, and laughed at his own joke. Guo Jian knew a warning when he heard one. The painting went back to his studio. The young journalists I worked with at CRI were bright and well-informed about Chinese affairs. They were also keen to improve their craft and wonderfully responsive to advice. Part of my job was to read the English language news, using material prepared by my colleagues. I decided to use the slightly wooden scripts as an opening to talk about the elements of good writing. "Try to keep the language fresh," I urged them. "Don't get trapped in a formula." One night, half an hour before airtime, I handed back a report from the Weather Bureau about how temperatures around the country were falling at the end of summer. "See if you can brighten this up," I said to the young woman who was on duty with me. She returned a few minutes later and put a new script into my hand. "Coolness is creeping over China," it began. "There's a feel of fall in the air." This gem of accidental poetry quickly became my mantra, because in those early years of the century, China was becoming very cool, as thousands of foreigners were discovering. There was a crackle of excitement, not just in the alleys of 798 and on the banks of Hohai, the once sleepy back lake to the Forbidden City in Beijing, but in the rooftop bars of Shanghai's Bund and the tree-lined streets of the city's old French concession. A new breed of Chinese urbanites were colonizing the old spaces of their cities, opening cafes and bars, clubs and small shops, creating a new infrastructure for a city that was open and colorful and cool. At Hohai, you could look out across the lotus-filled lake where at the turn of the previous century, Chinese poets had floated their wine cups on the water and listened to poets of the coming age, punk rockers from the capital, or folksies from the less plains of Shaanxi, while chatting to the bar owner who slept in a loft he'd constructed in the rafters and who shared his life with a dozen street cats he'd adopted as pets. Around Beijing, small clubs were opening up, providing entry to the alternative music scene every night of the week. You could see the all-female punk band, Hang on the Box, whose lead singer looked like Debbie Harry and sang like Sid Vicious, or the crazed folk rockers Glorious Pharmacy, or the wild-haired Askar, whose Xinjiang band, Grey Wolf, summed up the spirit of the Silk Road and of the eagles that soared above the Karakoram. Independent recording labels were starting up too, or you could buy music downloaded direct to a CD by a local enthusiast in a hole-in-the-wall shop in a hutong off Hohai. For much of the 2000s, the visas that allowed young foreigners to keep hanging on in China were quite simple to get. People would arrive on holiday or wangle work or business visas through a gray market of intermediaries. Then they would stay on, banding together with locals to launch pizza parlors or clubs, play bass in bands, or pick up bit parts in TV dramas, launch listing magazines or small fashion labels, front real estate companies or foreign galleries, and use sheer chutzpah to score jobs or business opportunities that would be out of reach at home. The authorities knew the visa system was loose, but they seemed to be making the correct calculation that these freewheeling foreigners were putting a lot more into Chinese urban life than they were taking out. I felt the winds of change at CRI, too. The station was firmly part of the propaganda system, but there was a group of young managers who were quietly pushing to make it a bit more than that. There was the one who headed up CRI English Online, who always came in early so that he could get in ahead of the official directives and make his own decisions about what stories to highlight on the website. There was another who took me aside when I first arrived to chat about the stories I'd produced at the ABC. He was the one who told me that the CRI leadership had certainly seen my police file before hiring me. It hadn't put them off, he told me, because they were looking for real journalists now, people who could bolster their own efforts to train their staff to be more professional. A few months in, they suggested that a Chinese colleague and I start our own weekly talk show, riffing on whatever news story of the week we decided to choose. One week, news of Elton John's nuptials sparked a lively show on same-sex marriage, while in another, the tragic news of the execution of Australian Van Tong Nguyen in Singapore led to a no-holds-barred debate on the death penalty. In private moments, two of the middle managers confessed they had been in Tiananmen Square in 1989. They didn't match the radicalism of the rights lawyers or even of their younger selves, but their daily attempts to improve the professionalism of what they did and to expand the space for journalism marked them out as different from their older superiors. Meanwhile, every day I found subjects being covered in the official media which had once been tantamount to state secrets. In the 1980s, we would hear of industrial accidents only rarely, and always months after the event. Now the scandal of the accident-ridden Chinese coal industry was exposed on a monthly basis, putting the real pressure on the government to improve safety. Natural disasters were covered in real time, along with their devastating effects. This in a country which had once erected screens along the railway line heading east from Beijing so passengers could not see the destruction wrought by the Tangshan earthquake of 1976. Of course, we still worked under tight boundaries and were reminded every day where they lay. There were key topics to be handled with extreme care, if at all. We foreigners called them the 3 Ts: Taiwan, Tibet, and Tiananmen. On these subjects, the correct line was clear and to be stuck to at all costs. Tiananmen was the great unmentionable. On the day that Zhao Ziyang died in 2005, the official government news agency issued a one-line announcement from which no one in the official media deviated by a syllable. All that day, work went on in the CRI office without discussion. Even as above our heads, the monitors tuned to the foreign news feeds showed an endless stream of footage of Zhao's final address to the students in Tiananmen Square and of the massacre that followed days later. But as I made my way to the kitchen to make coffee that afternoon, I noticed every one of my Chinese colleagues was silently reading the coverage of Zhao's passing on BBC.com. In 2006, Liu Xiaobo wrote an important essay, "To Change a Regime by Changing a Society." In it, he talked of how change can progress via actions in countless small environments, even ones located inside the belly of the authoritarian regime. For a few short months, I saw that happening inside the belly of one of China's great beasts, the Propaganda Bureau. It didn't last even as long as the 18 months I worked there, but it was just one of the many straws in the wind of the early 2000s that convinced so many that it was worth betting on change. And the Olympics were coming. Beijing's big moment was scheduled for August 2008. In the years leading up to the event, there was so much discussion about whether the Games might be a watershed moment for China. In South Korea, it was said the looming occasion of the Seoul Olympics had accelerated that country's move to democracy. Could China be in for the Olympics effect itself? The leadership had a different vision. The Olympics was to be the nation's grand coming-out party, making their final ascension into the club of major powers. China had become a member of the World Trade Organization in 2001 and was set to become the world's second-largest economy by the end of the decade. Now the Olympics would be a chance to put the nation on show. Aware of China's lingering image problem, which had scuttled their bid for the 2000 Games, the leadership crafted a pitch that highlighted the nation's ancient culture and its tradition of hospitality. The official Olympic song was a saccharine earworm called "Beijing Welcomes You," featuring a cavalcade of Chinese stars exhorting the world not to stand on ceremony and to step right in. "To know us is to love us," seemed to be the message. By mid-decade, I decided to stay and find out what 2008 would have in store. I wasn't to know it, but the Olympics would again confirm what Gorbachev's 1989 visit to China had already taught us, that long-planned historic moments can be upstaged at the last moment by history. Chapter 9. Isn't Something Missing? In 2008, at 8 p.m., on the 8th day of the 8th month, 2008 bronze drums sounded out across Beijing's Bird Nest Stadium, and the Olympic Games began. China was meant to have done away with superstition when Mao Zedong founded the People's Republic in 1949. But 6 decades later, no one was bothering to pretend anymore. Why not stack the odds in the home team's favor by invoking the power of 8, the luckiest of Chinese numbers? It certainly did the trick. The stunning opening ceremony went flawlessly, and by the final day of the Games, the Chinese team had topped the gold medal count for the first time in Olympic history. It was the successful climax of years of meticulous preparation and the source of 2 weeks of immense patriotic pride. But the Olympics are rarely the moment of national transformation that boosters predict. That certainly was true in China, where 2 much more significant events had occurred just 2 months earlier, at unscheduled dates and time, without warning and with terrible consequences. At 2:28 p.m. on May 12, 2008, an earthquake measuring 7.9 on the Richter scale hit the southwestern province of Sichuan. The quake's epicenter was in Wenchuan County, a mountainous region on the edge of the Tibetan Plateau, just 80 kilometers from the provincial capital, Chengdu. For 2 minutes the ground shook, and the earth split open for 240 kilometers along the fault line. In the quake and its aftermath, some 69,000 people died, and another 18,000 were declared missing. The tragedy galvanized the country. Ordinary Chinese rushed to help, donating record amounts of money and, in a nation traditionally reluctant to give blood, queuing at blood banks across China. People jumped on planes and trains or hit the road to Sichuan to volunteer. Young people gave up their jobs to go to quake-ravaged villages, like one young friend of mine who told me this was finally her chance to do some good in the world. None of it was driven by the government. It was inspired and organized by ordinary people rising to do what they believed were their responsibilities as citizens. The internet played a key role in spreading information, organizing efforts, and inspiring people to take part.